Good day and thank you for joining CivilNet today. My guest is Dr. Fernando Casal Bértoa. He's a research fellow at the University of Nottingham, also the co-chair of the Research Network and Election of the Council of Europe Studies, also a fellow at the Appella Institute. Thank you for being here. Given your extensive research into political party systems and knowing that you also have studied the Armenia's case, my first question was going to be if in 25 years Armenia went from communism to semi-presidential to now parliamentary, these many changes in such period of time, is this customary in connection to other countries, post-Soviet countries? Is this a good dynamic? Is this indicative of something?
Well, I mean, the truth is that all post-communist countries have to experience a lot of changes, changes that in many cases they were simultaneous, economic changes, political changes, in some cases, problems with statehood, Armenia also had this problem, when they declared independence, at the beginning of the 90s. Perhaps the more interesting path that we can see is the changes that we are seeing lately, with the constitutional reform, I mean, also too many changes at the same time, not only what you are mentioning, a change from the type of regime, from semi-presidentialism to parliamentarism, but as far as I know, they are changing also the electoral system, introducing a new, very peculiar electoral system that has never, ever been really proved, not even in Italy, where it seems to be the model that currently following.
I was going to ask you that next. So since the referendum last year, have you been following the changes that has been the consequent changes that are taking place in Armenia's constitution, electoral code being one? Are these explained in any way? Are these positive? Are these helpful in the development of political party system in Armenia?
Well, the hope is for the best, always, when you make changes, you usually try to make it for improving, The truth is that, the problem perhaps I see with all these changes is that doesn't seem to be a unanimous change, with these kind of debates between, the government and the opposition, also the referendum was not, we can say, unanimous in terms of, the acceptance by the voters. What is certainly controversial, with different opinions by, for example, the Council of Europe on the new electoral system. So perhaps the problem is the fact that it seems to be more a governmental-driven reform rather than an agreement between, the opposition and the government. And this obviously creates certain problems, especially for the future. Poland, for example, is a clear case where the constitution in 1997 was also passed with an important friction between the government and opposition. And since then, opposition, now in government, has been trying to change the constitution that was approved in 1987. And the same may happen here in Armenia, in the sense that perhaps when the current opposition will become part of the government, if it ever happens, they will try to change again the constitution. And this is certainly not very good prospect for the stability of the country.
So for an electoral code or for the authorities and the opposition to agree on certain changes to the electoral code and say we will implement them only when we've given $18 million of financing from abroad, only then these changes will, these agreements will come into force. Is this something that has a precedent in recent European or world history as far as electoral codes go?
You mean the controversy between the opposition and the government?
No, it's like when they've reached an agreement and the government seems to have agreed with the opposition.
Okay, and later they don't implement it, or they try to implement it in a different way. Well, I mean, the truth is that these things tend to happen in not fully democratized countries. This is the truth. Usually, there is always tensions between, government and opposition, but you always try to get a kind of agreement, because at the end of the day, democracy is not a one-party winning situation. And this is what makes democracy interesting, the possibility of alternation. Something that, unfortunately, as we all know, here in Armenia, hasn't happened. I mean, Linz and Stepan, two important academics that wrote especially about this region in comparative perspective with, for example, Latin America and Southern Europe. They agree that in order to really have democratic consolidation, you need to have alternation. And therefore, if you don't have alternation, it's very difficult that you have democratic consolidation and that we can say, reach agreements. And when the agreements are reached, you implement them.
And this new referendum, it's creating basically a two-block party system eventually. Is this going to help with the development of other political forces, political parties in Armenia?
Well, it's good that you are asking me this question because I will be talking about this this afternoon at the American University, invited by the Pella Institute. There, I mean, the thing is that, let's say, there are two forces here pulling to the appearance of this two-block party system. On the one hand, we have, the change from semi-presidentialism to parliamentarism that, as I will show this afternoon in a comparative perspective of 48 countries in 168 years, tends to reduce the number of parties. This is something. And on the other hand, we have the electoral system that, as it was agreed, also tends to reduce because of the high electoral thresholds and also the second round of voting. And therefore, we still don't know what is going to happen, because we still don't know even how it's going to be implemented. But the beginning of this two-block party system is foreseeable. If you ask me to what extent a two-block party system is good for democracy, well, like in life, you have trade-offs. It may well be for certain things and bad for others. For example, in the case of stability we can say in terms of government alternation, stability in terms of formation of the government, it is positive. In terms of accountability, we can even say that it's positive because you know who is governing, you know who has the responsibility, you vote them out or you vote them in again. In terms of representation, this may be problematic because, with a two-block party system, especially, in the type of party systems the type of two-block party systems that tend to develop in this region of the world, in this type of semi-democratic, also like in the Balkans, you always have one leading party in each bloc. And the other parties tend to follow suit. And therefore, in terms of representing, the different spectrums of society, they tend to fail.
You mentioned that the course we've taken now politically in Armenia is that eventually we could deduce that the number of political parties is going to come down. Yet what we see on the ground is there more political parties are emerging. What is the explanation of this? And also historically, Armenia's, the emergence of different political parties in Armenia, what's your evaluation of that?
Well, I'm talking always in the long term. This is a long-term trend, of course. Usually when there are changes because of the uncertainty and the instability, people tend to take advantage of that opportunity in order to create new parties. What we have seen till now is a rather high fragmentation. At the electoral level, you always have 5, 6 parties. What is rather high, in comparative perspective. But this is also because of the system you were having. The fact that you had these two dual arenas of competition. The presidential elections and the parliamentary elections. A lot of American Armenians, oligarchs, let's call it somehow, were taking the chances, to be visible in politics. Perhaps to connect business and politics, use patronage, to get visibility with elections, and therefore they needed a vehicle, and this was the parties. But in many cases, we may talk about this a bit further, where they were empty vessels, and this had negative consequences for the institutionalization of political parties. While, in the long term, parliamentary systems tend to make parties stronger. Because you need really to have these organizations in order later to implement your policies, in order even later to elect the president that is elected through the parliament itself and requires certain compromises.
And in Armenia's case, where we already see that political parties are not equally strong or equally weak, when we see that already one party is over-governing, how is this going to reproduce the power in a way?
Well, this is a very, it's a very difficult question. Predicting the future, is one of the most difficult
also
questions.
maybe taking into consideration the political and the public mindset and psychology in Armenia.
Okay, well, if we look at the patterns that we have seen now, what we see, is a party politics in Armenia have been characterized, I would say, by two main features. One is personalization, so leaders are very important, and therefore parties are living on the second place, even when voters made their electoral choices. And obviously things are not going to change from one day to the other, and obviously it will need the change with the political culture somehow. And the other one is about patronage. It's about using the state as a resource for vote buy, for asking for support, and therefore what we can see is, because the changes are going to make stronger two different parties, is the reproduction of the same patterns in just two parties. Usually the one that is already in government and already has all the structures and all the state resources, and another one that managed to lead the opposition.
Speaking of the opposition, Armenia has a history of consolidating an opposition and failing. In history or in your experience with successful opposition parties, what is Armenia lacking, or what is the model that could work in Armenia as for Armenia to have a consolidated political opposition party?
Well, unity. This is the thing that is lacking. When certain, especially in this kind of semi-democratic context, what is needed is an alternation. And for the government party that is all powerful, has all the state resources, all what we have been talking during the interview, what you need is that all the opposition, forget their differences, and think that they have a common, let's call it enemy, and establish a unique list that at least allow them to go to government. I'm sure that later there will be quarrels, there will be problems, but the problem is perhaps that you have to think about the general interest. I know that this is very difficult, and even in very consolidated democracies, all politicians have their parties and interests. But sometimes they try to forget about this, and especially if you really want to consolidate your democracy, you really need this. And therefore, in my view, is the only way, to forget about, personal difference, think about, the general interest, and propose a clear alternative for voters, of course. Because voters, just one thing, voters, if they see, that the parties are not united, if the parties are quarreling among themselves, if the parties, do not compromise among them when they have a lot to gain, it's impossible that voters will vote for those parties. Sorry.
Yes, and the general question, is the lack of ideology generally in Armenia and in the world today in political parties something that's making them weaker? Because a lot of political parties are working as organizations rather than political parties. Is a strong ideology something that might be missing in consolidating the opposition in Armenia or other political forces?
Well, I think that this is not a problem in Armenia, as you mentioned. I think this is certainly a general problem. The cry. Let's say, obviously, the triumph of democracy. Huntington, Fukuyama. The end of history. It was not really the end of history, but it was clear. The end of this polarization. Between two different clear. Ideologies. Has, we can say, weakened political parties, because what it happens is that because political parties, they don't differentiate so much from each other, they tend to converge in the center. This means that voters are not facing different policy alternatives, simply different teams of politicians that are going to implement the same program. And this has an important implication for the tiredness of the voters themselves. We see, not only in Armenia, in all Europe, voters tend to go to vote less, tend to participate less, tend to be members of parties less, because, they see that, they are, the same dogs with different colors, if you allow me the expression. And obviously, the problem of converging into the certain means that, like, in a black hole, it explodes, it leaves the streams edges of the political spectrum empty, allowing for the appearance of, populist, nationalist, extreme light, extreme left parties. So, it's not something that is happening only in Armenia. It happens also in other countries. Perhaps in Armenia is also visible because, the current party, the Republican Party, occupies the center, tries to go with parties on the center right, parties on the center left, and you have a very strong center. The same happened in Italy during the First Republic.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for being here today, and I wish you best of luck at the American University during your lecture today.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for the interview.
We thank the viewers for joining us as well.